I've spent a lot of time this semester running huge simulations on ludicrously expensive computer hardware at my university. But why? If you're new, hello, I'm Thomas. I am an astrophysics student at the University of St Andrews, finishing off my master's project. In a previous video, I gave a rundown of what it is that I'm actually doing, but if you want the 10-second version, I am using very large numerical simulations of fluids to simulate the formation of stars. Specifically, I'm looking at systems of 3 stars, and I'm investigating how changing the mass ratios of those forming stars affects how they gather up mass and angular momentum from a big accretion disk around them. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the simulations that I've been doing, why I've been doing them, why those ones, what the point of all this stuff is, and ultimately, what have I found so far? So, these simulations, they're not your quick, lightweight simulations that you can run in a couple of seconds on your computer. These things on the university's cluster, which has 16 cores, so around 4 times as powerful as your typical home PC, they take 4 days to run. Basically, these are not lightweight simulations. When you've got a million particles in your code, you're going to need to be able to work out the forces between all of them. That's a lot of very iterative, very repetitive maths, and it's gonna take quite a long time to run, even on a computer cluster. What I'm running are called smoothed particle hydrodynamics simulations. We're gonna break that down. First, hydrodynamics. This just means that we're going to be evolving the equations of hydrodynamics, the fluid equations. This lets us evolve the system and find the pressures and the densities and all these useful properties that we want. Next up is smoothed particle. This is the more technically nuanced bit of the video. If you really don't care how the code works, then feel free to just skip past this bit. Essentially, the way that smooth particle hydrodynamics works is it's a halfway house between n-body sims, like the ones I'm coding over on Twitch, where you have to work out the forces just through gravity between all of your point particles that you're simulating. It's a halfway house between an n-body sim and a full-on Eulerian fluid simulation where you've got like an amount of fluid in a cell and you track the changes of that, as opposed to keeping track of individual particles. So the reason I call it a halfway house is because it lets us look at the fluid properties like pressure and density like you would for a fluid, but while maintaining a sort of n-body particle-like structure to the code. Essentially, each particle of gas is smoothed out into a distribution by something called a smoothing kernel. You then find group properties, fluid properties like density and pressure, by looking at how these distributions overlap. The code does this in the background, I don't have to do this bit personally. But that's essentially how it works. You get density by looking at the overlap of these distributions, rather than what you would do in an Eulerian simulation, which is like a grid system, the things you'd be sort of familiar with. To get density in that sort of situation, you're just asking, how many particles are there in this grid cell volume that I already know the size of? It's much easier, it's much simpler. So you might be asking, why am I bothering with this whole smooth particle hydrodynamics thing? Well, the advantage that a smooth particle hydrodynamics, I'm just going to say SPH. The advantage of an SPH code is that it is what we call Lagrangian. Rather than having a grid-based system, the resolution is tied to the individual particles. We get resolution from the particle overlaps, not from having a grid. Now these particles, they still have positions, we can still resolve that without a grid, but the resolution, most importantly, is tied to the particles. This means we have resolution anywhere we have mass. Now this is of particular advantage in simulations like this because we're dealing with things on vastly different scales. Our accretion disk is hundreds of astronomical units across. I think by the time it's evolved for a while, it gets to about 500 astronomical units in radius, let alone in diameter. 500 astronomical units in radius is about 10 times the size of our solar system. And everything we really care about in this system is happening in the central 10 to 20. So we don't actually need that much resolution out in the sticks where there's nothing really going on. We want all of our resolution right in the middle where our triple system is. Now there are ways you can get around this limitation of a grid-based system using a grid-based code. One is called adaptive mesh refinement. Essentially you concentrate your resolution where you're interested, so you can split up your grid cells into smaller cells to keep that sort of resolution where you want it. But that sort of approach is really most useful when you're interested in something that isn't where the mass is. For what I'm interested in, I really care about what's going on where there is mass as opposed to where there isn't. So a Lagrangian simulation like an SPH code is perfect for this. But ultimately, what is the point of all this? What am I actually doing? Why do we care? So what I'm trying to do is to figure out what affects how the stars in my triple system accrete mass, how they gather up mass and angular momentum. Specifically, I'm looking at changing the mass ratios. So what happens if I make one star larger relative to another? What happens if I've got my small binary and it's bigger relative to the single star? How does this affect it? That is what I'm trying to answer in this project. So do I have an answer yet? Well, I have some provisional data. What I'm trying to do at the minute is reproduce these plots from a paper by Seppi and collaborators from May 2022. My data, however, looks more like this. That doesn't look right. What I've got is massive variation in my accretion rates over a course of like 36 years. I've established it's about twice the period of my wide binary, but I don't know why it's doing it. There are a few possible explanations. The first possible explanation is that I've done something wrong. I've set up the code wrong. We're using the same code they were using, so it should be able to be reproduced. So first possibility is I've done something wrong. The next option, which should be the more exciting, is that this is something new, or it's something that they saw and have smoothed out. What we're seeing is something called episodic accretion, and it might just be that the authors of that paper have just smoothed out all this variation to allow better comparison, and that is entirely possible. It's something that, if this turns out to be a real thing and we can't get rid of it by checking all of the stuff in the simulations, it could be something that we do decide, yeah, we're just going to smooth this all out to be able to work with the data, to be able to look at these comparisons, because what I'm looking at is the relative accretion rates, really, not the absolute ones. However, if that is something we have to do, and we have to go down this smoothing path, averaging it all out, I am going to have to talk about this. It's going to be something I investigate a bit further so I can put it into my thesis and describe it better, which is cool. New science. Awesome. I mean, well, I say new science. Episodic accretion is nothing new. We've seen it in like single stars, we've seen it for some binary systems, but this appears to be something a little different if this is a real thing. The real question we have is actually why it's not in this paper. Is it something they just didn't see? They're working with like an older version of the code and just it didn't appear for them? Is it something they smoothed out and didn't talk about? It's hard to say. I'm going to leave that paper in the description below. I've put it in the description below because we've talked about this paper a little bit before, but it does beg the question of, is it something I've done wrong? Is it something that just wasn't talked about in that paper? It could be either. It's going to take a little bit of investigation, but that's going to have to wait for another video. I'm really enjoying what I'm doing at the minute, researching this area of astrophysics. Getting to grips with these simulations and starting the data analysis is getting really exciting. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit more about how I'm analysing the data. I'll have some more complete results to share with you, and I hope to see you for that video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I will see you in the next one. See ya.